Joel Goldsmith discovered something that shattered everything the church taught him about Jesus. It wasn't heresy. It wasn't blasphemy. It was the original teaching that got buried under 2,000 years of dogma and fear. What he found changed not just his spiritual practice, but the lives of thousands who dared to listen. This isn't about religion. This is about direct spiritual experience. The religious establishment didn't want you to know this. They built entire institutions on keeping you dependent, keeping you small, keeping you believing you need an intermediary between you and the divine. Joel discovered that Jesus never intended to be worshipped. He intended to show you what you're capable of becoming. The Christ isn't a person to pray to. It's a state of consciousness you can experience. Here's what they don't teach in Sunday school. Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is within you, not within him, within you. He said you would do greater works than he did, not pray harder to him. Do greater works yourself. Joel realized that every miracle Jesus performed was a demonstration of a spiritual law that you can access right now. This isn't metaphor, this is instruction. The truth Joel taught. Jesus came to reveal your divine nature, not to be the only one who has it. That changes everything about how you approach prayer, healing, and your entire spiritual life. You've been taught to beg. Joel discovered you're meant to realize what you already are. Traditional Christianity teaches separation. You're the sinner. Jesus is the Savior. God is unreachable except through approved channels. Joel discovered this creates a consciousness of lack that blocks every spiritual demonstration. You can't heal from a consciousness that believes you're separate from healing power. You can't manifest abundance while believing you're unworthy of divine grace. What Jesus actually taught was mystical union. Not someday in heaven. Right now, in this moment. The Christ consciousness isn't something Jesus possessed exclusively 2,000 years ago. It's the eternal truth of being that exists in you this very second. Joel called it recognizing your sonship, not earning it through good behavior or correct belief, recognizing what's already true. This is why your prayers haven't worked the way you hoped. You've been praying from a consciousness of need, asking an external God to change external circumstances. Joel discovered that true prayer is the recognition of what already is in spiritual reality. You don't beg for healing. You realize there's nothing in spirit that needs healing. The body reflects consciousness. When you grasp this, every gospel teaching transforms. Turn the other cheek isn't passive submission. It's refusing to accept the appearance of evil as power. Love your enemies isn't moral superiority. It's recognizing there are no enemies in spirit, only divine beings wearing masks of human personality. Here's the practice Joel taught that churches avoid. Stop praying to Jesus and start praying from the Christ consciousness. The difference is everything. Praying to Jesus keeps you in the beggar position, hoping someone with more power will intervene. Praying from Christ consciousness means recognizing you already have access to the same infinite source that Jesus accessed. Jesus never said, "Worship me." He said, "Follow me. Learn what I learned. Do what I'm doing." The moment you make Jesus into God and yourself into a worm, you've missed the entire point of his teaching. Joel discovered that every time Jesus said "I," he meant the Christ within him. And that same "I" exists in you, not your human personality. The eternal divine identity beneath it. This is practical, not theoretical. When you face illness, instead of begging Jesus to heal you, you practice Christ consciousness. You don't deny the body's appearance. You simply refuse to give it ultimate reality. You recognize that in spirit, there is no disease, no lack, no limitation. As you rest in that truth, the body begins to reflect spiritual perfection. Joel proved this worked through decades of spiritual healing. Not positive thinking, not visualization, pure recognition of what's already true in the invisible realm of spirit. The external world has no choice but to conform to consciousness, that spiritual law. The final piece Joel revealed, the cross wasn't God's punishment for humanity's sin. It was Jesus demonstrating that even death has no power over Christ consciousness. He didn't die to save you from hell. He conquered death to show you that your true identity can never be destroyed. You are not your body. You are not your circumstances. You are eternal spirit appearing as temporary human form. This understanding transforms suffering. You're not being punished. You're not being tested. You're simply experiencing the outpicturing of whatever consciousness you're holding. Change the consciousness, and the experience must change, not through willpower, through recognition of spiritual truth. Joel called it the practice of the presence of God, not a distant God you petition, the presence that is your very being. When you truly grasp that Christ consciousness is your consciousness, prayer becomes meditation. You're not talking to God. You're listening. You're not asking for things. You're receiving the awareness of what Spirit has already provided. Everything you've been seeking externally exists in the invisible realm of consciousness. Your work is to recognize it, accept it, and watch it appear. This is the truth they silenced because it puts spiritual power back in your hands. No priests required, no rituals necessary. Just you, practicing the presence, recognizing your divine sonship, and watching your entire reality transform from the inside out. Joel spent 50 years proving it works. Now it's your turn. Margaret sat in Joel's meditation class in 1952, terminally ill with what doctors called incurable. She'd prayed every prayer the church taught her. She'd begged Jesus to intervene. She'd confessed every sin she could remember. Nothing changed. Her body continued deteriorating. Joel looked at her with deep compassion and said something that shocked her. Stop praying for healing and start recognizing wholeness. For 3 weeks, Margaret practiced what Joel taught. Every morning, instead of listing her symptoms to God, she sat in silence, recognizing that in spirit, there is no disease. She didn't deny her pain. She simply refused to give it ultimate power. She stopped seeing herself as a sick woman begging for mercy, and started recognizing herself as spiritual consciousness, temporarily experiencing a physical challenge. The shift happened gradually, not instantly. First, the fear dissolved. Then the pain lessened. Within 2 months, her doctors found no trace of the disease they'd declared incurable. Margaret didn't get healed. She recognized she'd never been separate from wholeness. The body simply reflected the change in consciousness. This wasn't miracle. This was spiritual law in operation. Joel documented dozens of cases like Margaret's over 5 decades of ministry. People with tumors, heart disease, paralysis, mental illness. Not every case showed immediate physical healing, but every person who truly grasped Christ consciousness experienced inner transformation that changed everything. Some bodies healed, some didn't. But every consciousness that awakened found peace beyond circumstances. Robert was a successful businessman who'd built his empire through aggressive competition and ruthless strategy. He attended one of Joel's lectures in Hawaii, expecting religious platitudes. Instead, Joel spoke about consciousness creating experience. Robert scoffed. 3 months later, his business collapsed overnight. Partners betrayed him. Investments failed. He lost everything. Desperate and broken, Robert returned to Joel's teachings. This time he actually listened. Joel taught him that his consciousness of struggle and competition had attracted exactly what he feared most: loss and betrayal. The external world was simply reflecting his internal state. Robert began practicing what Joel called living from grace instead of law. Every morning for 6 months, Robert sat in meditation, recognizing divine abundance as the only reality. He stopped trying to manipulate circumstances and started resting in spiritual supply. He didn't visualize money. He recognized the infinite nature of Source. He didn't scheme to rebuild his business. He let consciousness guide him to right action. The rebuilding took 2 years, not 2 weeks. But what emerged was completely different from what collapsed. Robert created a business based on cooperation instead of competition, on service instead of exploitation. He prospered beyond his previous success, but this time from a consciousness of abundance rather than fear. Joel's teaching hadn't just restored his finances, it had transformed his entire relationship with life. Elizabeth spent 40 years in traditional Christianity, faithful and devout. She attended church every Sunday, served on committees, taught Sunday school. Yet she felt spiritually empty. Her prayers seemed to bounce off the ceiling. Jesus felt distant, unreachable. She loved God but couldn't feel God's presence. Joel's teaching found her when she was ready to give up on spirituality altogether. What shocked Elizabeth most was Joel's statement that she'd been taught to worship Jesus instead of learning from Jesus. She'd made him so divine that she'd missed his actual message. You have the same access to God that I have. For months, Elizabeth struggled with this idea. Wasn't it blasphemy to claim divine sonship? Joel gently showed her dozens of gospel passages she'd read for decades but never truly seen. The transformation happened during a silent meditation retreat. Elizabeth stopped praying words and simply sat in the presence. For the first time in her life, she felt what Joel called the click, a moment of recognition beyond thought where she knew, not believed but knew, that Christ consciousness was her consciousness. Tears streamed down her face. This was what she'd been seeking for 40 years. Elizabeth didn't leave her church, but her practice changed completely. She no longer prayed to an external God. She practiced recognizing the presence within. Her relationships deepened. Her health improved. Her joy became unshakable because it no longer depended on circumstances. Joel had given her what traditional religion couldn't: direct spiritual experience. Thomas was a minister who secretly struggled with doubt. He preached salvation through Jesus, but privately wondered if any of it was real. He'd seen too many faithful people suffer, too many prayers go unanswered. When he discovered Joel's recordings, everything he thought he knew about Jesus shifted. Joel wasn't denying Jesus. He was revealing what Jesus actually taught before doctrine obscured it. The crisis came when Thomas realized he'd been teaching people to depend on external salvation instead of awakening to their divine nature. He'd kept them small and dependent when Jesus came to set them free. For 6 months, Thomas wrestled with whether to continue ministry. Joel's teaching gave him a new framework. He could serve without lying. He could honor Jesus while teaching Christ consciousness. Thomas gradually transformed his ministry. Instead of preaching sin and salvation, he taught meditation and presence. Instead of encouraging petition prayers, he guided people into recognition of what already exists in spirit. Some congregants left, uncomfortable with the shift, but others awakened to direct spiritual experience for the first time in their lives. 2 years into this new approach, Thomas watched his congregation transform. Healings occurred, relationships restored. People discovered peace they'd never found through traditional doctrine. Joel's teaching hadn't destroyed Thomas's ministry. It had fulfilled it by revealing what Jesus actually intended. Not worshipers, but awakened beings living from Christ consciousness. If these transformation stories inspire you to explore this hidden truth, like this video to help others discover Joel Goldsmith's revolutionary teaching. Subscribe for more mystical Christianity wisdom, and comment. Which story resonated most deeply with your spiritual journey? Beyond meditation, Joel taught a practice he called recognizing the nothingness of error. When you face any problem, your natural response is to fight it, fix it, or pray for its removal. Joel discovered this approach gives the problem power. Instead, you practice recognizing that in spiritual reality, the problem doesn't exist, not as denial of appearance, but as recognition of what's true in consciousness. Here's how it works practically. You face a financial crisis. Traditional religion says pray to God for money. Positive thinking says visualize abundance. Joel taught something radically different. Recognize that in spirit, there is no lack, period. You don't try to change the external circumstance. You rest in the awareness that divine supply is infinite and always available. As consciousness shifts, circumstances must reflect that shift. This practice requires spiritual maturity. You're not pretending the problem isn't there. You're refusing to give it ultimate reality. You acknowledge the appearance while recognizing that appearances are temporary and consciousness is cause. The bank account shows 0, but spiritual reality knows nothing of limitation. You hold both truths simultaneously without trying to manipulate the outer to match the inner. Joel proved this principle through decades of demonstration. Not every problem dissolved immediately, but every consciousness that genuinely rested in spiritual truth eventually saw external confirmation. The timing isn't yours to control. Your work is recognition, not manifestation. Manifestation happens automatically when consciousness aligns with spiritual reality. Joel taught another complementary practice, living in the now. Not as New Age philosophy, but as spiritual law. The only place Christ consciousness exists is this present moment. Your mind wants to live in past regrets or future anxieties. Joel discovered that every spiritual problem exists only when you leave the now. In this moment, stripped of mental commentary, where is the problem? Practice this right now. Put aside past and future completely. What's happening in this exact second? You're alive. You're conscious. You're reading these words. Is there suffering in this pure moment, or only in the thoughts about other moments? Joel taught that the practice of presence isn't escaping life, it's discovering where life actually exists, here, now, always. This transforms prayer from petition to presence. You don't ask God to fix your future. You recognize God as the only power operating in this present moment. Every gospel teaching Jesus gave was about now. The kingdom of heaven is at hand means it's available right now, not after death. Consider the lilies means stop projecting into tomorrow and see divine provision operating today. As you practice living in the now, you'll notice something remarkable. Problems lose their grip because they exist only in time. Pain might be present, but suffering about pain requires thought about past or future. Joel wasn't teaching you to ignore life. He was showing you where real life happens, in this eternal moment of Christ consciousness that never leaves the present. The third complementary practice Joel taught was recognizing oneness, not as mystical poetry, but as practical reality. Every problem you face stems from the belief in separation. You're separate from God, from supply, from health, from other people. Joel discovered that this belief in separation is the only actual sin, which means missing the mark of truth. Spiritual reality knows only oneness. When someone wrongs you, traditional religion says, forgive them. Joel taught something deeper. Recognize there's no separate person to forgive. There's only one divine consciousness appearing as many forms. The person who wronged you is Christ consciousness temporarily forgetting itself, just as you sometimes forget your divine nature. This doesn't excuse harmful behavior. It removes the emotional charge that keeps you trapped. Practice this with every relationship challenge. Instead of seeing an enemy, recognize a divine being experiencing human confusion. Instead of feeling victimized, recognize that nothing in spirit can actually be harmed. Your eternal identity is untouchable. The human personality might feel hurt, but Christ consciousness remains forever whole and complete. This oneness extends to everything you desire. You're not separate from the abundance, health, or peace you seek. They're not out there waiting to be acquired. They exist in consciousness right now. Your work isn't pursuing them. Your work is recognizing you've never been separate from them. As that recognition deepens, external experience must confirm what consciousness knows. Joel's final complementary practice was what he called living by grace. Grace isn't God's mercy toward sinners. Grace is the automatic flow of divine good that operates when you stop trying to earn, manipulate, or control. Every attempt to make something happen comes from the belief that you're separate from Source. Living by grace means recognizing that Source is already supplying everything before you ask. This practice feels terrifying to the human mind. You stop planning, stop strategizing, stop trying to force outcomes. You simply rest in spiritual truth and let consciousness guide you to right action. This isn't passivity. It's the most active spiritual practice possible because it requires constant vigilance against the mind's desire to take control and make things happen through human effort. Joel proved this principle repeatedly. He never advertised his lectures or promoted his books. He simply taught what he'd discovered, and thousands found their way to him. Divine grace supplied everything needed without manipulation or hustle. The human mind rebels against this approach, insisting you must do something. Joel discovered that spiritual consciousness is always doing everything. Your work is getting out of the way. As you practice these complementary tools alongside recognizing Christ consciousness, your entire spiritual life transforms. You're no longer a beggar approaching an external God. Your consciousness recognizing itself as the presence and power of God, right here, right now. Everything Jesus taught becomes practical instruction instead of impossible ideals. Here's the challenge nobody mentions. When you first practice Christ consciousness, your circumstances might get worse before they improve. Joel warned his students about this. You're shifting from one state of consciousness to another, and the transition can be turbulent. Old patterns resist dying. The ego fights recognition of its unreality. Problems you've been avoiding surface for healing. Sarah practiced Joel's teaching faithfully for 3 months and watched her life fall apart. Her marriage hit crisis. Her business struggled. Her health declined. She called Joel in desperation, convinced she was doing something wrong. Joel's response shocked her. Everything false in your life is being revealed so truth can replace it. Don't abandon the practice now. Go deeper into Christ consciousness. This is where most people quit. They return to traditional prayer, begging God to fix the chaos. Joel taught that this chaos is actually progress. Consciousness is cleaning house. Everything not built on spiritual truth must crumble, so what's real can emerge. The false marriage must end so the true relationship can begin. The business based on struggle must fail so the business based on grace can form. Sarah stayed with the practice. 6 months later, she looked back and saw that everything that fell apart needed to fall apart. The marriage that ended had been dead for years. The business that failed had drained her soul. The health crisis forced her to address patterns she'd been ignoring. Joel's teaching hadn't caused the chaos. It had revealed what was already there. Another obstacle Joel's students faced was the silence of God. You practice presence. You meditate. You recognize Christ consciousness. And nothing seems to happen. No voice, no vision, no dramatic spiritual experience. Just silence. The mind interprets this as failure or God's absence. Joel taught that the silence is actually the goal, not the problem. God doesn't speak in words because God isn't a person. God is consciousness itself. The silence you fear is actually the presence you seek. When thoughts quiet, what remains is pure awareness. That awareness is Christ consciousness. You keep waiting for something dramatic to happen, missing the fact that the transformation is occurring in the silence itself. Joel compared it to a seed growing underground. Nothing appears to be happening above the surface, but massive change is occurring in the invisible realm. Your consciousness is shifting, even when you can't perceive it. The external results come later, after the internal foundation has been established. Trust the silence. Rest in the silence. The silence is where true spiritual work happens. This requires patience that modern spirituality doesn't teach. You want instant results, immediate confirmation that you're doing it right. Joel discovered that real spiritual transformation takes time, not because God is slow, but because consciousness shifts gradually as false beliefs dissolve and truth becomes established. 3 months of practice is just the beginning. Joel practiced for 50 years and said he was still learning. The third major obstacle is doubt. You practice Christ consciousness and doubt creeps in. Maybe this is all delusion. Maybe Joel was wrong. Maybe you should return to traditional religion where at least you know what you're supposed to believe. Joel faced this doubt himself in his early years. He understood the temptation to abandon spiritual practice when results don't match expectations. Here's how Joel handled doubt. He didn't fight it or deny it. He recognized that doubt arises from the human mind, not from Christ consciousness. Consciousness itself never doubts because it simply is. The doubt is another thought passing through awareness. You can observe the doubt without being controlled by it. Let the doubt be present while you continue practicing presence. Over time, Joel noticed something remarkable. The more he practiced despite doubt, the less power doubt had. Not because he conquered it through willpower, but because consciousness was establishing itself as primary reality. Doubt still appeared occasionally, but it no longer determined his actions. He continued practicing presence whether doubt was present or absent. This is spiritual maturity. You don't wait until you feel certain to practice. You practice despite uncertainty, despite doubt, despite lack of external confirmation. Joel taught that consciousness develops through use, like a muscle. The more you practice recognizing Christ consciousness regardless of how you feel, the more established that consciousness becomes. Faith isn't believing hard enough. Faith is continuing to practice when belief wavers. The final obstacle Joel addressed was the problem of persistent negative patterns. You recognize Christ consciousness. You practice presence, yet the same problems keep appearing. The same relationship patterns, the same financial struggles, the same health issues. Your mind screams that the practice isn't working. Joel taught that these persistent patterns reveal deeper consciousness that needs addressing. Every external pattern reflects internal consciousness. If the pattern persists, there's a belief operating below your awareness that keeps creating it. Joel's approach was to sit in meditation and ask consciousness to reveal the hidden belief. Not asking God for answers, but letting your own awareness show you what you can't see. The answer always comes when you're truly ready to see it. Michael struggled with poverty consciousness for years despite practicing Joel's teaching. One day in meditation, the hidden belief surfaced. He believed spiritual people should be poor to prove they're not materialistic. This belief operated unconsciously, sabotaging every financial demonstration. Once he saw it, he could recognize it as false. Spiritual consciousness knows nothing of poverty. Within months, his finances transformed. This is deep work that requires brutal honesty. You can't heal what you won't acknowledge. Joel taught that every persistent problem is an invitation to discover false beliefs you don't know you're holding. The problem isn't punishment, it's teacher. As you bring these hidden beliefs into consciousness and recognize their unreality, the patterns lose power, not through effort, but through recognition of truth. If these obstacle-transforming insights are breaking through your spiritual barriers, like to support this revolutionary teaching, subscribe for advanced Christ consciousness practices, and comment, which obstacle are you ready to transform through Joel Goldsmith's wisdom? Joel taught advanced practitioners to carry Christ consciousness into daily activity, not just meditation. This is where theory becomes practical demonstration. You're in a business meeting and tension rises. Traditional response is to react, defend, or attack. Christ consciousness response is to silently recognize that only God is present here. Not God watching the meeting, but God as the only consciousness actually operating. This takes practice. Your human personality wants to engage in the drama. Joel taught that you can function in the human world while remaining anchored in spiritual awareness. You speak when necessary, act when required, but you're not lost in the appearance of conflict. You're recognizing that beneath all human interaction, there's only one divine consciousness temporarily appearing as many personalities. Linda practiced this in her toxic workplace. Instead of quitting or fighting, she began silently recognizing Christ consciousness as the only presence. When her boss attacked her, she didn't take it personally because she recognized both of them as divine consciousness having a human experience. The external behavior didn't immediately change, but her inner peace became unshakable. Over 6 months, something remarkable happened. Either her boss softened significantly, or Linda was moved to a different department, or she was guided to a new job. Joel taught that when you hold spiritual consciousness steady, the external must eventually conform. You don't know how or when. You simply practice presence and trust that consciousness knows what needs to happen. Another advanced practice Joel taught was recognizing perfection in apparent imperfection. Someone is ill. Traditional response is to pray for healing. Joel's advanced teaching was to recognize that in spiritual consciousness, there is no illness to heal. The body's appearance doesn't determine spiritual reality. This doesn't mean ignoring medical care. It means recognizing truth while dealing with appearance. David's daughter was diagnosed with a serious condition. Every instinct said to panic, to beg God for intervention. Joel had taught David to practice presence even in crisis. David sat with his fear, acknowledged it, and then practiced recognizing his daughter's true spiritual identity as whole, complete, and perfect, not denying her symptoms, but refusing to accept them as ultimate reality. The treatment process was difficult. There were setbacks and scary moments, but David maintained spiritual consciousness throughout. He didn't make healing the goal. He made recognition of truth the practice. Whether the body healed or not, his daughter's spiritual identity remained forever perfect. This consciousness gave both of them peace that transcended circumstances. The body did heal, but that's not the point. Joel taught dozens of students whose bodies didn't heal but whose consciousness awakened to eternal life. Physical healing is wonderful when it happens. Consciousness awakening to its divine nature is the real transformation. When you practice this advanced recognition, you're no longer at the mercy of external circumstances. You've found the peace that passes understanding. Joel's most advanced teaching addressed the problem of evil. How do you practice Christ consciousness when facing genuine malice, violence, or cruelty? Traditional religion says evil is real and God will punish it. Joel taught something radically different. Evil has no power except the power you give it through belief. This isn't naive optimism. This is spiritual law. When Jesus said, "Resist not evil," he wasn't teaching passivity. He was revealing that evil is appearance without ultimate reality. The moment you resist it, you make it real in your consciousness. The moment you fight it, you empower it. Joel taught that the only way to overcome evil is to recognize its nothingness. Not that it doesn't appear to harm, but that it has no actual power in spiritual reality. This is terrifying to practice. Someone wrongs you severely. Your mind demands justice, revenge, or at minimum acknowledgement of the evil done. Joel taught that this response keeps you trapped in the consciousness that attracted the experience. The way through is recognizing that evil is simply good misunderstood, truth forgotten, love temporarily obscured by human confusion. As you practice this recognition, something extraordinary happens. Either the situation resolves in ways you couldn't have orchestrated, or you're removed from it, or you develop such inner peace that external circumstances lose their power to disturb you. Joel wasn't teaching you to accept abuse. He was showing you how to free yourself from evil's power through recognition of its unreality. The final advanced practice Joel taught was becoming a transparent consciousness. This means you're so established in Christ consciousness that you become a healing presence without doing anything. People feel peace around you. Situations resolve when you enter them, not because you're special, but because consciousness operating through you recognizes only spiritual reality. Joel reached this state after decades of practice. He would sit in a room and simply be present. People reported physical healings, emotional breakthroughs, spiritual awakenings. He wasn't doing anything to them. His consciousness was simply so clear of personal agenda that divine consciousness could operate unobstructed. This is the goal of all spiritual practice. Complete transparency to truth. You don't achieve this through effort. You achieve it through persistent recognition of what's already true. Every day, you practice presence. Every challenge, you recognize Christ consciousness. Every interaction, you see divine identity beneath human personality. Over years, not days or months, consciousness becomes so established that it operates automatically. This is what Jesus demonstrated. He wasn't born special. He achieved complete transparency to Christ consciousness through practice and recognition. Joel taught that this same achievement is available to you, not because you're better than others, but because consciousness itself is your true identity. As you practice these advanced tools, you're not becoming something new. You're recognizing what you've always been, beneath the layers of false belief. After decades of teaching, Joel reflected on what he'd learned about transformation. The process isn't linear. You don't climb a ladder from unconsciousness to enlightenment. You have moments of profound recognition followed by periods of forgetting. The practice is returning to presence each time you realize you've left it. This is the spiritual journey, not arriving, but continuously returning. Some students experienced dramatic healings and life changes within months. Others practiced for years before seeing external results. Joel discovered that timing wasn't the issue. Depth of realization was what mattered. You could practice for decades with shallow understanding and see limited change. Or you could have one moment of profound recognition that transformed everything instantly. The key wasn't how long you practiced, but how deeply you recognized truth. One student had a single meditation where Christ consciousness became absolutely real, not as concept, but as experienced reality. Her life transformed within weeks. Another student practiced diligently for 5 years and finally had the recognition during a walk in nature. Suddenly, everything Joel taught clicked into place. Joel himself said his deepest recognitions came after 40 years of practice. He thought he understood Christ consciousness early on, but each decade revealed deeper layers. He remained humble, acknowledging he was still learning, still discovering new dimensions of spiritual truth. This humility kept him open to revelation. The moment you think you've arrived, you've stopped growing. Joel's teaching about Jesus ultimately comes down to this. Jesus wasn't God's only son. He was the first to fully demonstrate what divine sonship means. He came to show you what you are, not to be the only one who is it. Every miracle he performed was meant to wake you up to your own spiritual power. Every teaching he gave was instruction for your transformation. When you practice Christ consciousness, you're not worshiping Jesus. You're following his actual instruction. He said, "Learn of me, not worship me." He said, "You are the light of the world, not I am the only light." He said, "The kingdom of heaven is within you, not within me alone." The church changed his message because awakened people don't need institutions. This understanding restores Jesus to his rightful role, spiritual teacher and way-shower, not distant deity requiring intermediaries. You have direct access to the same source he accessed. You have the same divine identity he recognized. You can demonstrate the same spiritual laws he demonstrated, not because you're special, but because consciousness itself is what you are. Joel spent his life proving this works. Thousands of students demonstrated healing, transformation, and spiritual awakening through his teaching. Not because Joel had special power, but because he accurately taught what Jesus actually meant. The truth was always there in the Gospels. It just got buried under layers of doctrine designed to keep you dependent and small. The practice doesn't end. Christ consciousness isn't a destination you reach and then coast. It's a living, breathing awareness you maintain moment by moment. Some days you feel clearly established in truth. Other days you forget completely and get lost in appearances. Joel taught that this is normal and expected. You're human, experiencing divine consciousness. The journey is eternal. What changes is your relationship with forgetting. Early on, you might forget for days or weeks before remembering to practice. As consciousness establishes, you notice forgetting sooner. Eventually, you might forget for only moments before presence returns. The goal isn't never forgetting. The goal is shortening the time between forgetting and remembering. Joel practiced until his death at age 73. Even then, he said he was still learning, still discovering new dimensions of Christ consciousness. This should encourage you. You're not trying to achieve perfection. You're practicing presence. Every moment you recognize truth, consciousness establishes more deeply. Every time you return to presence after forgetting, the return becomes easier. Your spiritual journey is unique. Your timing is your own. Your challenges are specifically designed for your awakening. Joel taught that everything in your experience is consciousness revealing itself. The pleasant and the painful, the easy and the difficult, all serve the same purpose, waking you up to what you've always been but temporarily forgot. Here's what Joel ultimately discovered after 50 years of practice and teaching. The entire spiritual journey is about recognizing what's already true. You're not becoming divine. You're recognizing divinity as your nature. You're not earning God's love. You're accepting that love is what you are. You're not acquiring Christ consciousness. You're removing the beliefs that obscure your awareness of it. This truth changes everything about how you live. Prayer becomes recognition instead of petition. Challenges become opportunities for deeper realization instead of problems to solve. Other people become mirrors showing you aspects of consciousness instead of separate individuals to judge or control. Every moment becomes sacred because every moment is consciousness experiencing itself. The relationship with Jesus transforms completely. He's no longer the distant savior you beg for help. He's the elder brother who showed you the way home. His life demonstrated what's possible when human consciousness fully recognizes its divine identity. His teaching provides the roadmap for your own awakening. His love supports you as you walk the path he walked. Joel's legacy is this. He restored Jesus' original teaching from beneath 2,000 years of religious distortion. He proved that ordinary people can experience extraordinary spiritual transformation through recognizing Christ consciousness. He demonstrated that healing, peace, and abundance flow naturally when consciousness aligns with spiritual truth. The practice works. The question is, will you practice? If your spiritual understanding of Jesus and your divine nature has been revolutionized by these Joel Goldsmith revelations, like this video to help others discover this hidden truth, subscribe for more mystical Christianity teachings that transform lives, and comment, "I am transformed," to confirm your new consciousness and spiritual path.
My friends, there comes a moment in every seeker's life when the old way of living can no longer sustain us. A moment when we discover, often through struggle, that no amount of human planning, no amount of personal effort, no amount of mental striving has given us the peace, the harmony, or the fulfillment we have been seeking. And so we arrive here, not by accident, not by chance, but by an inner impulse, an impulse of the Spirit itself, drawing us to a deeper truth. You see, the great turning point of the spiritual life is not the moment we decide to become better people, nor the moment we adopt new practices, nor even the moment we dedicate ourselves to prayer. The true turning point comes when we awaken to the startling realization that we have been trying to live life through a self that was never equipped to live it. The personal sense of self, that little me that worries, fears, plans, controls, has tried to carry the entire burden of existence upon its shoulders. And because it is limited, because it is finite, because it was never the source of life, it has inevitably come to exhaustion. Now, I want you to hear this clearly, because the world has missed it. The spiritual path does not begin when you try harder. It begins when you can no longer continue as you have been. It begins when you realize that there is a presence within you that has been waiting patiently, silently, lovingly for you to step aside. A presence that does not need your strength, that does not require your intelligence, that does not depend upon your human understanding. A presence that is the very life of God, the very life of Christ, expressing itself as your consciousness. And so in our time together, we are going to explore what actually happens deep within the chambers of your being when you finally allow this presence to take its rightful place. When you cease living from the personal mind and begin living from the Christ mind, when you stop striving to make life work and begin resting in the life that already is, not theory, not philosophy, but the actual experience of the divine living, its life as you. If you can receive this, if you can hear it, not with the intellect, but with that inner listening that responds to truth, something will begin to shift even now. For when truth is spoken, the Christ within each of us recognizes itself, and in that recognition, transformation begins. Now, let us move deeper into this principle. For before we can understand what it means to let Christ live our life, we must first see clearly what has been living our life until now. And this, perhaps more than anything else, is the great stumbling block in spiritual realization, our unexamined identification with a self that is not the self. From early childhood, we are conditioned to believe that we are a separate being, an isolated mind, a vulnerable body, a personal identity struggling to survive in a threatening world. We learn to say, I must do this, I must achieve that, I must protect myself, I must make my life work. And without noticing it, we become prisoners of this personal I, this finite sense of self that is constantly planning, worrying, resisting, defending. But the personal self is not your true identity. It is not the Christ. It is not the divine. It is not the presence that Jesus spoke of when he said, I and the Father are one. It is in truth a mental image, an accumulation of beliefs, memories, fears, and reactions. It has no spiritual substance. It has no divine authority. It has no reality. in the kingdom of God. And yet, this is the self we have been living from. This is the self we ask to solve our problems. This is the self we expect to guide us, protect us, heal us, and supply us. And then we wonder why life feels heavy, why fear clings to us, why peace eludes us. We wonder why our prayers seem unanswered, why our spiritual efforts bear so little fruit. The answer is astonishingly simple. We have been attempting to live life through a self that is not alive in God. The separate self has no access to the infinite because it is built upon the belief in separation. The personal mind cannot touch the divine because it is formed out of the very belief that the divine is somewhere else. So listen carefully. All fear arises from the illusion of separation. All lack arises from the illusion of separation. All sickness, all anxiety, all striving arise from the illusion of separation when you believe yourself to be a separate entity, living by your own power, sustained by your own strength. You place yourself outside the kingdom of God, not in truth, but in your own perception. And from that moment on, life becomes a struggle, because the self you are living from is disconnected from the source of life. But the miracle is this. The separate self is not something you must conquer or improve. It is something you need only see through. The moment you recognize its unreality, its power dissolves. The moment you perceive that it is not the one living your life, it falls away like a shadow disappearing before the sun. And in that instant, a new awareness begins to dawn, an awareness not born of effort, but of revelation. There is another self within you, a self that is whole, complete, infinite, untouched by human limitation, a self that is not separate from God because it is the activity of God itself. This is the Christ. This is the one true self. This is the life that is waiting to live as you. And so now, having looked upon the nature of the personal self, we must turn to the reality that has always been present behind it. The reality the world has called Christ, though the world has seldom understood what that word truly means. If we are to let Christ live our life, we must know what Christ is, not intellectually, not theologically, but as inner recognition. In the infinite way, when we speak of Christ, we are not speaking of a person. We are not referring to a historical figure, though such a figure may have embodied the principle. We are speaking of the divine presence, that is the true identity of every individual on earth. The Christ is the light of God expressing itself as your consciousness. The Christ is the fullness of divine life, living you, breathing you, sustaining you. The Christ is the truth of your being unborn, undying, untouched by human circumstance. It may help to see it this way. Just as the sun shines whether the clouds appear or not, so the Christ shines as the essence of your being whether the personal self recognizes it or not. When the clouds thicken, clouds of fear, guilt, self-judgment, or worldly belief, the light seems hidden, but the Christ remains just as radiant, just as present, just as whole. You have never lived a moment without it. You have never taken a breath apart from it. The Christ is not something you acquire, it is something you discover. Now, hear this with the inner ear. Christ consciousness is not a higher level of your personal mind. Christ consciousness is the absence of your personal mind. It is the state in which the personal I, with all its fears, ambitions, doubts, and demands, grows quiet, and the divine I begins to reveal itself. It may help to see it this way. Just as the sun shines whether the clouds appear or not, so the Christ shines as the essence of your being whether the personal self recognizes it or not. When the clouds thicken, clouds of fear, guilt, self-judgment, or worldly belief, the light seems hidden, but the Christ remains just as radiant, just as present, just as whole. You have never lived a moment without it. You have never taken a breath apart from it. The Christ is the truth of your being unborn, undying, untouched by human circumstance. This presence does not reason. It does not fear. It does not struggle. It does not pray to God, for it is the activity of God. It does not seek supply, for it is the outflow of infinite supply. It does not heal, for it is the wholeness that reveals the unreality of disease. When you touch this presence, even briefly, life begins to reorient itself. The mind grows quieter. The heart feels lighter. You no longer feel alone in the universe. You no longer feel responsible for the entire burden of existence. You begin to sense that there is a divine rhythm, subtle, gentle, but unmistakable, moving your life forward with infinite intelligence. And the most important truth of all is this: this Christ, this presence, this divine consciousness is not waiting to enter your life. It is waiting to be recognized. It is the reality that has been living you from the beginning, but the personal self has stood in front of it like a curtain blocking the sunlight. Pull back the curtain, and you discover that the light was there all along. So, when we speak of letting Christ live your life, we are speaking of removing nothing and adding nothing. We are speaking of a shift from illusion to truth, from separation to oneness, from personal effort to divine expression. We are speaking of the revelation of what you have always been. Now, having glimpsed the nature of the Christ within, we come to one of the most sacred moments in the entire spiritual journey, the moment of surrender. Not the surrender the world imagines, not defeat, not resignation, not the giving up of hope. No, the surrender we speak of in mystical practice is entirely different. It is the quiet realization that the personal self has no role in the divine life that is unfolding as you. There comes a time, perhaps you have already felt it, when all the effort, all the struggle, all the attempts to improve, correct, or control your experience reach their limit. You discover that no matter how sincere your striving has been, it has not opened the gate to peace, and in the exhaustion of that striving, something holy begins to take place, a softening, a release, a willingness to stop leaning on your own understanding. This is the moment when the inner voice whispers, "I cannot do this anymore." And far from being a failure, that whisper is the beginning of grace. For in that very admission, you cease trying to live life according to the laws of the personal mind, and you enter the atmosphere where the Christ can reveal itself. You see, the personal self tries to make things happen. The Christ allows things to unfold. The personal self reacts to conditions. The Christ stands still in the presence of conditions. The personal self fears the future. The Christ lives in eternal now. The personal self seeks protection. The Christ is protection. When you come to the end of the personal self, when it can no longer carry the burden, you are not falling into emptiness, you are falling into God. You are falling into the arms of the presence that has been carrying you since before you drew your first breath. And what makes this surrender sacred is that it is not something you perform. It is something that happens to you. It is not something you force. It is something you allow. This surrender may come as a deep breath that loosens the chest. It may come as a moment of stillness in the midst of panic. It may come as a sudden recognition, I don't have to figure this out. It may come as an inner voice saying, be still and know. But however it comes, it always carries the same fragrance, the fragrance of rest. Not the rest of inactivity, but the rest of trust. Not the rest of escape, but the rest of realization. The rest that comes when the false sense of self yields and the true self begins to shine through. And let us understand this clearly. Christ does not enter your life because you surrender. Christ is revealed because surrender removes the veil. Christ has been living your life all along, but the personal sense of self has been pretending otherwise. The moment you stop trying to live life through the personal mind, a subtle, quiet presence begins to emerge. You feel guided without thinking. You feel supported without asking. You feel carried without effort. You begin to sense that something within you, yet greater than you, has taken over the activity of your life. This is the first taste of letting Christ live your life. This is the beginning of the inner shift. This is the dawn that precedes the full light of realization. And now, my friends, we enter the sacred territory where the spiritual life ceases to be theory and becomes experience. For when the personal sense of self grows quiet, when the mind relaxes its desperate grip upon life, something begins to take place within you, something subtle, yet unmistakably real. It is the dawning of a new state of consciousness, the emergence of the Christ that has always been the truth of your being. This shift does not announce itself with fanfare. It does not come with lightning or excitement. It comes gently, so gently that the personal mind almost misses it. In fact, it is often recognized only in hindsight, when you look back and realize that something in you has changed, though nothing external seemed to bring about that change. The first sign is often a deep, unexplainable stillness, not the stillness of inactivity, but the stillness of an inner atmosphere, quiet, spacious, luminous, a sense that something within you has stopped struggling. You may still have the same circumstances, the same challenges, the same responsibilities, but they no longer feel as heavy, as urgent, as threatening. Something within you has shifted from reaction to recognition. Then there arises a second sign, a clarity that does not come from thinking. You find that guidance emerges of itself. You know what to do without effort. You respond without premeditation. You speak words you did not plan. You take steps you did not analyze. And afterward, looking back, you say, I did not think of that. It was given. This is the activity of Christ in you, the divine intelligence expressing itself without the interference of the personal mind. A third sign appears in the form of effortless right action. Actions unfold without strain. Tasks you once resisted become smooth. Decisions that once paralyzed you become simple. This does not mean that life becomes free of events. It means that the events no longer dominate your inner equilibrium. There is a divine rhythm moving through your affairs, and you feel yourself carried by it. Then, without your trying, without your affirming, without your visualizing, there begins to emerge a loosening of fear, not because the circumstances have changed, but because something within you knows with quiet certainty that you are not living by your own power. Fear loses its foundation when the sense of separation dissolves. The Christ, being infinite presence, has no fear, and when Christ is allowed to live your life, fear fades like a shadow retreating before the morning light. And one day you become aware of something even more subtle, a feeling that you are not the one doing the living. You are watching life unfold, watching the actions take place, watching the words form, watching the path open before you, and yet you know that these are not the products of personal striving. They are the expressions of a deeper self. This is the inner shift. This is the beginning of the life lived by the Spirit. This is what takes place when the Christ begins to assume its rightful place as the life, the mind, the activity of your being. You do not make this shift happen. You do not earn it. You do not control it. It arises naturally the moment the personal I steps aside, even slightly. The Christ that has always been present begins to show, self first gently, then steadily, then undeniably. And with each moment of recognition, the old identity grows weaker and the new identity grows clearer. This is the beginning of a life that is no longer lived for God, but from God. Not for the purpose of gaining good, but as the expression of good. Not as an effort to solve life, but as the revelation that life is already solved in God. Now, it is one thing to taste this inner shift in moments of meditation, in periods of stillness, in quiet hours when the world recedes. But what does it mean to live from Christ consciousness? To carry this awareness into the activities, the relationships, the responsibilities, and the challenges that make up daily living? For mysticism, true mysticism is not an escape from life. It is the discovery of a higher life revealing itself through your ordinary life, a divine life expressing through human conditions, a spiritual rhythm moving through the most practical moments of your day. And so we begin by noticing what happens in our relationships. When Christ lives your life, you no longer approach others as personalities difficult, demanding, flawed, or admirable. Instead, you begin to sense that each one you meet is an appearance of the same divine presence that lives as you. You may still see their behavior, you may still notice their words, but you are no longer reacting to those surface elements. You are responding from a center of recognition, and in that recognition, the Christ in you beholds the Christ in them. This does not mean you condone unkindness or ignore injustice. It means you no longer meet darkness with darkness, personality with personality, fear with fear. You meet it with presence. You meet it with the awareness that only the Christ is real. And gradually, you find your reactions softening, your words arising from compassion rather than defense, your interactions becoming less entangled in egoic patterns. Peace begins in the moment you cease defending the personal self. Then we look at work, at our daily tasks and responsibilities. When the personal mind governs your work, it becomes a burden. You push, you force, you calculate, you strain. But when Christ lives through you, your work becomes an avenue of expression for divine intelligence. Ideas appear without effort. Solutions arise before the problem fully forms. Actions flow naturally. You begin to notice that what you once dreaded now unfolds with ease, not because the task has changed, but because the doer has changed. For mysticism, true mysticism is not an escape from life. It is the discovery of a higher life revealing itself through your ordinary life, a divine life expressing through human conditions, a spiritual rhythm moving through the most practical moments of your day. Then we turn to the realm that troubles most people, finances and supply. When you live from the personal sense of self, money becomes a source of fear because you believe that it is supply. You believe that your well-being depends upon conditions, accounts, opportunities, or individuals. But when Christ consciousness begins to live as you recognize that supply is not money. Supply is the activity of God appearing as form. Money becomes a channel, not a source. And because the source is infinite, the channels are endless. This does not mean that money mysteriously falls from the sky. It means that fear dissolves because you no longer place your trust in the outer form, you trust the inner reality. And as fear dissolves, clarity arises. Opportunities unfold. Directions become obvious. You take steps you would not have considered before, not from desperation, but from inspiration. And you find that your needs are met not by struggling for them, but by recognizing that supply has always been spiritual. Then we consider health, another area where the personal self often trembles. The personal mind looks to the body and sees vulnerability, fragility, decline. It tries to fight symptoms, resist conditions, battle disease. But Christ consciousness does not fight disease. It does not oppose the appearance of illness. It simply rests in the truth that divine life is the only life, and that this life, being perfect, cannot express as imperfection. Healing, then, is not the correction of the body, it is the correction of identity. As you recognize yourself as the life of God, wholeness begins to reveal itself, not through conflict, but through recognition. This is what it means to live daily life from Christ consciousness. You do not withdraw from the world. You do not transcend responsibility. You do not float above daily experience. You remain in the world, but you are no longer of it. You move through life with a center that is not shaken by appearances. You speak from a depth that does not depend on circumstance. You act from a wisdom that is not your own. You love with a heart that is not personal. And gradually, your entire life begins to reorganize itself, not because you change the outer world, but because you change the level from which you live. This is the beginning of divine order expressing itself in your affairs. This is the beginning of a life lived not by effort but by grace. Up to this point, everything we have spoken of may sound peaceful, harmonious, even beautifully simple. And indeed, the spiritual life is simple, divinely simple. But simplicity does not mean the personal mind will surrender without resistance. In fact, the moment you begin to shift your identity from the personal self to the Christ within, you will encounter certain misunderstandings, certain doubts, certain subtle forms of resistance that must be understood, not fought, not feared, but recognized for what they are. Let us speak first of impatience. The personal self has been conditioned for results. It lives by cause and effect. It measures, it judges, it evaluates progress, and so when you begin to walk the spiritual path, that same tendency quietly enters your practice. You find yourself thinking, I have been seeking the presence for days, weeks. Why has nothing changed yet? But you see, the very question reveals the old consciousness at work. Christ does not come because you practice. Christ is revealed because the personal sense of self relaxes. And that relaxation cannot be hurried. It unfolds according to grace, not impatience. Then there is the desire to use Christ consciousness for personal gain. This is subtle. Perhaps you say, now that I know the truth, I will use it to heal this condition, to attract this supply, to resolve this problem. But the moment you attempt to use the Christ for a personal purpose, you have returned to the personal self, for the Christ has no personal purpose. The Christ is the presence of God, and God does not serve human will. Truth cannot be used. Truth can only be yielded to. So long as you try to make God act, you are still outside of the kingdom of God. Another resistance is doubt, especially when outer appearances seem unchanged. The personal mind looks at the world and says, if nothing has improved, nothing spiritual is happening. But remember, appearances are the last to change. Consciousness changes first, silently, invisibly, often without any emotional fireworks. When a seed is planted, nothing appears above the soil for some time, yet beneath the ground, life is already stirring. So it is with spiritual realization. The Christ often works in depths your mind cannot perceive, preparing the outer world for a shift that may seem sudden, but is the result of inner transformation long underway. There is also the temptation to fall back into effort, especially when life becomes challenging. You begin to feel the pressure of circumstances, and without noticing, you slip into the old patterns, trying to fix, trying to plan, trying to force, trying to control. But this is the moment when you must be most watchful, most gentle with yourself, not scolding the mind, not condemning yourself for slipping, but simply returning quietly, humbly to the awareness that Christ is living the life, not you. And perhaps the greatest resistance of all is the belief that you are unworthy. Many a sincere seeker says, surely this truth is for the advanced, the holy, the chosen. Surely I cannot expect such grace. But this thought is the final veil of the personal self, for the Christ in you has no sense of unworthiness. The Christ does not look at your past, your mistakes, your human frailties. The Christ knows only one thing: I and the Father are one. And when you hear that, even faintly, even for a moment, you are already beginning to transcend the old identity. The key is always the same. Do not fight the resistance. Do not argue with the mind. Do not attempt to conquer doubt or impatience or fear. Simply recognize them as movements of the personal self and let them pass. Return gently and again to the awareness that there is a presence within you greater than the mind, a presence that does not resist, does not fear, does not demand, a presence that knows how to live your life because it is your life. When resistance arises, it is not a sign of failure. It is the sign that the personal self senses its dissolution and clings to what is familiar, but it cannot endure. The light of Christ inevitably dissolves every shadow. And now we come to the heart of the mystical life, the summit toward which every step of the spiritual path has been leading. For all the practices, all the recognitions, all the moments of surrender are preparing you for one great realization, the realization expressed in the words, I live, yet not I. Christ liveth my life. These words, spoken by Paul, repeated by mystics across centuries, are not poetry, they are not metaphor, they are the literal description of what takes place when the false sense of self dissolves and the true self begins to shine unobstructed. You see, the personal I is never truly alive. It is a shadow, a concept, a bundle of conditioned thoughts. It cannot live because it has no life in it. But the Christ, the presence of God, individualized as you, is life. And when the personal self yields, even for a moment, you begin to experience something astonishing. Life begins to live itself. Actions take place, words are spoken, steps are taken, without the weight of self-consciousness, without the strain of personal will, without the burden of seeking results. The first time this happens, you may not even notice it. Perhaps you find yourself responding with kindness in a moment when the old self would have reacted with irritation. Perhaps you speak words of clarity that surprise even you. Perhaps you take an action that feels effortless, inevitable, guided, and afterward you realize, I did not do that. Something moved through me. That something is not foreign to you. It is your very self, your divine self, finally unobstructed by the noise of the personal mind. As this realization deepens, life begins to reorganize itself. You discover that inspiration comes before thought. Guidance arises before planning. Harmony appears before effort. And outcomes unfold without anxiety. This is not passivity. It is participation in a higher order of life. This is not the abdication of responsibility. It is the discovery of the true source of responsibility. This is not the loss of individuality. It is the unveiling of divine individuality. For when the Christ lives your life, something profound occurs. You no longer experience yourself as the center of existence. You experience God as the center and yourself as the expression of that center. You cannot explain this to the intellect. You cannot analyze it or pin it down. It is as if an inner door opens, and instead of you living your life, life, capital L, begins to flow through your being like a river moving through an unobstructed channel. You wake in the morning not with dread or duty, but with a quiet expectancy. What is the Father expressing today? You speak not to be understood or approved, but because the words arise naturally. You act not out of compulsion or pressure, but because the next step reveals itself effortlessly. And perhaps the most beautiful sign of this realization is the disappearance of fear, not because you are protected from harm, but because the one who feared no longer claims identity. Fear belongs only to the personal sense of self. The Christ has no fear, for it knows nothing exists outside of its own infinite presence. In this state, healing is no longer an event you seek. Healing is the inevitable consequence of abiding in wholeness. Supply is no longer something you chase. Supply is the natural expression of infinite abundance. Harmony is no longer a goal you work toward. Harmony is the inner order of divine life showing forth in form. You are no longer striving to become spiritual. You are realizing that you have never been anything else. I live, yet not I. That is the death of the false identity. Christ liveth my life. That is the birth of true individuality. This realization is not achieved through discipline or force. It is not the result of spiritual ambition. It comes quietly, naturally, inevitably, when you rest in the truth of your being, when you stop trying to think or feel your way into God and allow God to be the self that lives. And once you taste this truth, even briefly, you know without doubt, without argument, without explanation, that the personal self has never been your identity. The Christ has always been living your life. You simply did not recognize it. Now you begin to recognize it. Now you begin to live from it. Now you begin to understand that the life you call my life is God's life, appearing in a form that bears your name. This is the fullness of realization. And so, my friends, we come to the close of this particular message, though in truth there is no close, for the spiritual life has no beginning and no ending. It is the continuous unfolding of divine consciousness, the eternal revelation of the Christ within. What we have spoken of today is not something to be remembered, nor something to be practiced as a human being attempts a technique. It is something to be recognized quietly, gently, faithfully, in the depths of your own being. Everything you have ever sought, peace, supply, harmony, health, purpose, has been hidden only by one illusion, the belief that you were the one living your life. When that belief dissolves, even a little, the presence takes its rightful place, not as an addition to your life, not as a helper alongside your efforts, but as the very life itself. The Christ is not someone you invite. It is the reality you uncover. If there is one practice I would leave you with, it is simply this. Before you begin your day, before you check your phone, before you consider your tasks or responsibilities, take a moment, just a moment, and turn within. Not to think something, not to repeat something, simply to acknowledge, Father, you are the life that is living me. Or if those words resonate differently for you, Christ is the only self I am. This recognition does not need force. It does not need belief. It requires only sincerity. One sincere moment of recognition carries more transformative power than hours of mechanical meditation. For when you acknowledge the presence, even briefly, you loosen the grip of the personal sense of self. You create an opening through which the Christ expresses itself more freely. Throughout the day, return again and again, not as a discipline, but as a remembering, a brief pause, a quiet breath, a gentle inner turning, just enough to recall that you are not the doer, not the thinker, not the one upholding your existence. You are the instrument through which the divine is expressing its infinite activity, and in time, without your effort, without your will, without your strain, You will discover that life has become different not because circumstances have dramatically changed, but because you have changed. Your center has shifted from the personal to the universal. The false I has grown quieter. The true I, the Christ, has begun to take its rightful place. This is the grace of the spiritual path. This is the fruit of recognition, not the remaking of your life, but the revelation of your life as it truly is. God in expression, God as your consciousness, God as your being. May you come to see that the kingdom you have been seeking is already within you. May you feel the presence going before you, making the crooked places straight. May you rest in the assurance that the life you call mine is the infinite life of God. And may the Christ, the living presence within you, reveal itself more fully each day until you can say with complete inner certainty, I live, yet not I. Christ liveth my life.